Someone wants to come back into your life. Not because they are lonely, not because their circumstances have changed and you have become convenient again. They want to come back because something in them has never stopped knowing what was real between you, and yet they have not come back. Not because they do not want to, but because something invisible, something older and more powerful than their conscious desire, has been holding them in place. And what Carl Jung discovered about this invisible force will explain everything that their silence never could. Part 1 Full Script. Dr. Audrey Sinclair had a habit she had developed early in her career and never abandoned. At the beginning of every new client relationship, before any history had been shared, before any presenting concern had been described, she would ask one question. She would look at the person sitting across from her, and she would ask quietly and without preamble, "What are you most afraid of discovering about yourself?" Not what are you afraid of in general, not what has brought you here. What are you most afraid of discovering about yourself? The answers were almost never what people expected to say. They surprised themselves. And in that surprise, in the gap between the answer they had prepared and the one that arrived instead, was almost always the most important thing in the entire subsequent work. A woman named Margot sat across from Dr. Sinclair on a Friday afternoon in early spring. She was 36 years old. She had the composed, slightly careful presentation of someone who had learned to lead with competence rather than need. She heard the question and was quiet for a long moment. And then she said, "That I am easier to leave than I believe I am." Dr. Sinclair said nothing. She simply waited. Margot continued, "Someone I was close to left my life 6 months ago. Not dramatically. Not with a confrontation or a defined ending. They simply became gradually less present until the presence was gone entirely. And I have been telling myself that it was circumstances, that life intervened, that these things happen. But there is a part of me that keeps returning to the question of whether it was me, whether something about me made the leaving easier than the staying." Dr. Sinclair said, "And what does the evidence actually tell you?" Margot said, "The evidence tells me that they still think about me. I know this not because they have said it, but because of the specific way the absence feels. It does not feel like the absence of someone who has moved on. It feels like the absence of someone who is still present somewhere just outside the frame. Still close, still aware, but held back from crossing back into the visible world by something I cannot see, and they have not explained." Dr. Sinclair leaned forward slightly. "That distinction you just made," she said, "between the absence of someone who has moved on and the absence of someone who is still close but held back, that is not a minor distinction. That is the most important distinction in your entire situation. And the fact that you can feel it so precisely means that something real is communicating it to you." Carl Jung spent much of his professional life studying what he called the invisible architecture of human behavior, the structures that exist beneath the level of conscious awareness and that shape what people do in ways that their conscious minds can observe but cannot fully explain or control. He believed, and documented with extraordinary clinical thoroughness, that the most significant forces governing human relationships were almost never the ones that were visible on the surface, were almost never the product of conscious decision, were almost always the expression of something formed long before the present relationship existed, and operating now with an autonomy and a persistence that had nothing to do with what the person currently wanted or consciously intended. He called these structures complexes, and he believed that understanding them was the key to understanding almost everything that looked, from the outside, like inexplicable human behavior, like the person who clearly cares and inexplicably stays away, like the relationship that clearly matters and is nevertheless inexplicably not returned to, like the feeling, accurate and persistent, that someone is close but held back by something neither person has been able to name. A man named Conrad had come to Dr. Sinclair 6 weeks before Margot. He had not come because he was in pain, at least not pain he would have described in those terms. He had come because he was confused, and Conrad was a man who was not accustomed to confusion. He was a software architect. His professional life was built entirely on the satisfaction of understanding how systems worked, of finding the logic beneath the apparent disorder, of tracing the behavior of complex structures back to their underlying rules until the whole thing became transparent and navigable. His interior life had been, until recently, managed with a similar approach. He understood his own patterns reasonably well. He could identify the origin points of most of his behaviors. He had done enough reading and enough reflection to have what he considered a workable map of his own psychology. And then something happened that the map could not account for. He had left a relationship. Not abruptly, not cruelly. He had withdrawn, gradually, and then completely, from someone who had been significant to him. And he had done it, he told Dr. Sinclair, without entirely understanding why, not without reasons. He had reasons. He could articulate them clearly. They were coherent reasons that made sense when he examined them individually. But they did not add up to the magnitude of the leaving. The reasons were not large enough to explain the distance. And he knew it. And he had spent 6 months watching himself maintain that distance with a consistency and a thoroughness that continued to function independently of the fact that he had been thinking about this person every single day since he had created it. He said, "I know what I want. I want to go back. I think about going back constantly, and something stops me every time. Not fear exactly, or not only fear, something older than fear, something that activates before I can examine it, and produces the same result every time, which is that I do not move. I stay where I am. And I watch myself stay where I am, with what I can only describe as the frustration of someone who is observing a machine doing something they did not program it to do and cannot find the override." Dr. Sinclair said, "The machine was programmed, just not by you, not by the conscious you, by something that formed before the conscious you had any say in the matter. This is the essential truth about the invisible force. It is not a choice. It is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of insufficient feeling or inadequate commitment or the simple fact of not caring enough. It is a structure, a psychological structure formed in the earliest years of a person's life, assembled from the specific emotional experiences of their particular history, and refined across every subsequent relationship until it has become so automatic, so completely integrated into the person's way of operating in the world, that it functions without any conscious instruction. Jung called the most powerful of these structures the mother complex and the father complex, not because they are always specifically about the mother or father as individuals, but because the earliest relationships of a person's life, the relationships in which the most fundamental lessons about love and safety and proximity and loss were first encoded, leave the deepest imprints, and those imprints become templates. Invisible templates that are laid over every subsequent relationship, and that shape what feels safe, and what feels dangerous, and what feels like something that must be moved away from before it can be lost. Conrad's template had been formed in the context of a father who was present and then absent, not through death or abandonment in the dramatic sense, through the gradual emotional withdrawal of a man who had his own unaddressed wounds and who had expressed love during Conrad's childhood with an inconsistency that had taught the child a lesson that man had never intended to teach. The lesson was this: what you love and depend on will eventually pull back, not because you have done anything wrong, simply because that is what love does. It arrives, and then at a moment you cannot predict, and a time you cannot prepare for, it begins to recede. Conrad had taken this lesson and built an entire relationship strategy around it, a strategy whose logic was impeccable and whose cost was enormous. The strategy was simply this: leave before you are left. Create the distance before the distance is created for you. Withdraw before the withdrawal comes from the other direction. It had worked, in the narrow sense that strategies work when their only criterion for success is the avoidance of a specific form of pain. He had never experienced the specific pain of being left by someone he had fully stayed for. He had experienced instead the different, quieter, more chronic pain of being the one who left before the full depth of connection could be established. The pain of living always slightly outside of what he could sense was possible, always at the edge of something real, rather than inside it. And now he was on the outside of something real enough that the strategy, for the first time, was failing to convince him that the safety it offered was worth the cost. Margot, on her side of the silence, had been reading the absence correctly all along. The person she was waiting for was not gone. They were at war with themselves. They were being held back not by indifference or by a conscious decision that she was not worth returning to. They were being held back by something that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the invisible architecture of their own history. Dr. Sinclair explained this to Margot, not as comfort, not as something designed to make the waiting easier, but as clinical truth, as the actual structure of what was happening, because she believed, and had always believed, that the most useful thing she could give her clients was not reassurance but clarity, real clarity, the kind that allowed them to see the situation as it actually was, rather than as the anxiety of waiting tended to distort it into. The invisible force holding someone back from returning is almost never about the person they are returning to. It is almost always about what the return requires of them, what it demands, what it asks them to finally face about themselves and their own history, and the specific way that their particular formation has shaped their relationship to intimacy and risk, and the terrifying possibility of being fully present in something that matters. And facing that for most people is not a single moment of courage. It is a process, a gradual, sometimes agonizing process of becoming sufficiently conscious of the structure that is running the show to be able to finally override it, not eliminate it, override it, to act in the presence of the fear rather than waiting for the fear to resolve itself into something that feels less threatening before acting. This process takes the time it takes. It cannot be rushed from the outside. It cannot be accelerated by the waiting person's hope, or grief, or the quality of their patience. It happens at its own pace, in the interior of the person who is being held back, according to the specific requirements of their own psychological formation. What the waiting person can do, and this was the most important practical insight that Dr. Sinclair gave Margot, is attend to their own process with the same seriousness, because the most powerful thing the waiting person can do is not to wait in a way that is oriented entirely outward. It is to use the period of waiting as an opportunity for the most important work available, the work of understanding their own invisible architecture, of becoming conscious of their own invisible forces, of arriving at a place of such genuine interior clarity and self-possession that when the return eventually comes, they are able to receive it from a position of genuine wholeness, rather than the accumulated desperation of waiting too long in the wrong direction, because two people arriving at the same moment, both having done their own work, both having moved through their own invisible forces to reach the shore, meet in a way that is qualitatively different from two people who arrive at different levels of readiness, different levels of consciousness, different degrees of having faced what needed to be faced. The meeting of two people who have both done the work is not a reunion. It is a beginning. Orvar sicken 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 sicken. Part 2. Sicken sicken sicken. 3 weeks into his work with Dr. Sinclair, Conrad said something that she would later write down in her clinical notes because she recognized it as a moment of genuine breakthrough. He said, "I have been treating the leaving as a decision I made, as though I assessed the situation and concluded that distance was the appropriate response. But I did not make that decision. Something made it for me, something that was running entirely on its own logic, and I was watching it happen from somewhere slightly behind my own eyes, aware that it was occurring, unable to intervene." Dr. Sinclair said, "And now that you can see the mechanism," he said, "now I am starting to be able to put my hand on it, to feel it activate, and recognize it for what it is, rather than experiencing it as simply what I want. The two things are not the same. What I want and what the mechanism produces are not the same, and that distinction is new. That is genuinely new. This is the first movement of real change in the context of an autonomous complex. Not the elimination of the force, not the sudden absence of the fear, or the old pattern or the mechanism formed in childhood, but the development of the ability to distinguish between the mechanism and the self, to feel the complex activate, and recognize it as the complex rather than as a direct expression of genuine desire or reasoned choice. Jung called this the development of the observing ego, the part of the conscious mind that can step back from the automatic operation of the complex and observe it with enough clarity to have for the first time the possibility of choosing differently, not easily, not without the full presence of the fear and the resistance and the entire weight of every previous repetition of the pattern, but with the awareness that the pattern is a pattern, that it is not the truth, that it is not who the person actually is at their deepest level, that it is what was learned, and that what is learned can, with enough consciousness and enough courage, be unlearned. Conrad began to move, not dramatically, not with a grand gesture or a definitive return, but in the small, specific, psychologically enormous way that genuine movement always begins. He began to allow himself to think about her without immediately redirecting his attention. He began to sit with the feeling of missing her, instead of converting it into a reason why returning would be complicated. He began to notice the mechanism as it activated, and to respond to the noticing, rather than simply being carried by the mechanism. And in noticing, he began to choose. Margot came to Dr. Sinclair for the 8th session with a quality of presence that was different from any of the previous 7. Something had settled in her. Not resigned. Something deeper than resignation. Something that had the quality of genuine arrival. She said, "I have stopped asking whether the absence is about me. Not because I am certain it is not, but because I have realized that the answer does not change what I need to do. What I need to do is the same regardless of the answer. I need to be the most genuine, most present, most fully inhabited version of myself. Not as a strategy for bringing him back, simply because that is the only version of myself worth being." Dr. Sinclair said, "Tell me what changed." Margot said, "I stopped treating the waiting as a period between the real parts of my life. As though my actual life was on pause until the situation resolved. And I started treating it as part of the real thing. As part of the process of becoming someone who can hold this without losing herself in it. And when I made that shift, something became available to me that was not available before. A kind of clarity, a kind of solidity, a sense that whatever happens, I am not diminished by it, because I have been doing the work, the real work, the interior work, and that work is mine regardless of how the external situation resolves. This is the transformation that the invisible force, and the period of waiting that it produces, is ultimately designed to facilitate. Not simply the return of the other person, though that may come, but the return of the self. The recovery of the part of oneself that is capable of being fully present, fully alive, fully in contact with what is real, without requiring a specific external outcome as the condition for that aliveness. Jung wrote about this through the concept of the self. Not the ego, which is the conscious, managed layer of personality, but the self with a capital S, the deeper center of the psyche. The organizing intelligence that is always, beneath every complex and every persona and every constructed adaptation to circumstance, moving a person toward their own wholeness, their own completion, their own fullest and most genuine expression of who they actually are. The invisible force that holds someone back from returning is, from the perspective of the self, not an obstacle. It is a teacher. It is creating the conditions under which both people are required to go deeper into themselves than they would have gone if the return had been easy. It is generating the specific pressure under which the psychological growth that makes a genuine reunion possible is produced. Because a reunion that happens before this work is done, before the invisible force has been faced and moved through rather than simply circumvented, does not produce something new. It produces a repetition. It returns two people to the same dynamic that produced the original rupture, and the rupture will come again, perhaps in a different form, perhaps more slowly, but it will come. What makes the return genuinely different is the change in the people returning, the degree to which each person has become conscious of their own invisible architecture, has recognized the mechanism for what it is, has developed the observing ego that can distinguish between the complex and the genuine self, has done the interior work that makes genuine presence in the relationship possible in a way that it was not possible before. Conrad reached out on a Thursday evening in late April, not with a prepared speech, not with an explanation that covered everything, with something much simpler and much more honest than anything he had been trying to construct in his mind for weeks. He said, "I have been held back by something I am only beginning to understand, and I do not have a clean explanation to offer you. But I have something more important than a clean explanation. I have the willingness to finally stop being held back." It was not perfect. It was not the version of the return that the paralysis of perfect timing had been demanding, but it was real. It was genuinely, completely, entirely real, and it arrived from a place in him that the mechanism, for all its persistence and all its sophistication, had never been able to reach. The place that had always known what it wanted, that had always recognized what was real, that had been waiting, with the patience of something that knows its own truth, for him to finally stop standing in its way. Margot received it from exactly the place she had arrived at in her own work. Not from desperation, not from the anxious quality of someone who has been waiting too long in the wrong direction. From herself, from the solid, clear, unhurried center of a person who has done the work and knows where she stands. She said, in her response, something that Dr. Sinclair would also write in her clinical notes. She said, "I know. I have been able to feel the holding back, And I have been using the time it took to become someone who can meet you honestly rather than gratefully. There is a difference, and now there is a meeting to have. Jung said that the most difficult of all human tasks is to maintain consciousness in the face of the unconscious, to see the invisible architecture, to recognize the mechanism, to distinguish between the complex and the self, to act from the self rather than being acted through by the complex. Both of them had done that, not completely, not perfectly, not in a way that meant there would be no further complexity or no further work, but genuinely, in the real, imperfect, courageously honest way that actual psychological growth always occurs. And what met them on the other side of all that work was not simply each other. It was a version of each other that had not existed before, a version shaped by everything that had happened in the silence, everything that had been learned and faced and moved through in the time they had been held apart by the invisible force. Not despite that force, because of it, because the invisible force, for all the pain it produced, for all the weeks and months of confusion and waiting, and the specific ache of something real that is close but not yet arrived, had been doing exactly what Jung said the unconscious always does when it is working correctly. It had been moving both people toward the work that needed to happen before they could genuinely arrive at each other. And when they finally did arrive, they brought with them everything that the work had made possible, which was, in the end, everything that actually mattered.